Hi, welcome to my demo on new tricks with half square triangles. I'm Teresa Weaver from Your Sewing Friend, and I've got some neat tips for you today. You know, half square triangles is probably one of the easiest blocks you can do for a quilt, and it's very versatile. You can do a lot with it, make all kinds of designs. So I've been playing around with that a lot, and I've come up with some time-saving techniques for sewing and cutting. So I'm going to show you how to do that today. So the first thing we're going to do is take squares that are about the same size. Okay, these are the same size, and we're going to talk. First thing I'm going to show you is how to chain piece, and this is a little different than what you're normally going to hear about chain piecing. So I'm going to sew down one side. I'm going to line up my 1/4 inch foot with the drawn line on my square here, and then I'm just going to sew down one side. Now instead of taking the next square and putting it there, we're going to do something else. I'm going to raise my needle and my presser foot, spin this around, then I'm going to take the next square and chain piece. And what's nice about this is that you don't have to go back. Once you get done with a square, it's done. I'm going to get part way through here. I'm going to come back here and clip these squares apart. Now one thing you're going to see on here, it looks like this is bunched up a little bit. All you got to do is take your scissors, snip, and it's fine. So now I'm going to finish this square. Do the same thing. Lift the needle and the presser foot, scoot this over, and sew down the other side. So pretty easy, right? So one thing I want to mention too, if you're doing a wide variety of charm squares and you've got prints that are directional, and you can see this fabric is directional, you always want to audition your fabrics by folding them in half like this before you sew to make sure the picture is the way you want it. You don't want it going sideways, you want it going up and down. So you audition it to make sure both ways, to make sure it's the direction you want. On this one especially, this is two directional fabrics. So if you look at it like this, it looks like it's upside down. If I turn around this way, it's right side up. Now if I had done the fabric, the diagonal line the other way, and then flipped it that way, one of them would have been upside down, the other one would have been right side up, and that wouldn't have looked right. So that's just a little tip. So now, what do you do when the squares you have are not the same size? So I have this pile of squares, charm squares, that I've collected from swaps over the years, and they're not all exactly the same size. So you could go through and trim them all, and we all know cutting is one of the least fun parts of quilting. So who wants to cut more, right? So instead of doing that, I came up with another trick. You don't need to trim your squares ahead of time. So here I've got some squares. You can see they're slightly different. They're not the same size. So what I did is I took the smaller square and lined it up with two sides of the bigger square. That's all you got to do. So this one, I've got my line drawn on the light fabric, so that's on top. On this one, the dark fabric is on the bottom. You can see my line is drawn there. So I'm going to take that square again, line it up with two sides of the bigger square, and then sew, just like I did before. So we're going to just go down one side of the line, oops, one side of the line, and get to the end, lift up the needle and the presser foot, flip it around, and then this one, the dark's on the back, so I make sure it's lined up where I want it, and I'm going to flip it over and sew. Again, raise my needle on my presser foot, flip it around, move it over, line up the foot with the drawn line, and sew down the other side. So now, normally, this is where you would cut your triangles. Oops. You would cut the triangles apart, but we're not going to do that yet. First, we're going to press. Because once you cut that apart, you've got that bias edge, and that's easily distorted. So we're going to press this while it's still intact, so it doesn't do that. It's more stable this way. So I'm going to give it a quick little press to help those stitches go down in the fabric. And then we're going to trim. So I'm going to show you this one, because this is the one that you can't really see it very well. So what you're going to do, you're going to take this diagonal line on your ruler, and you're going to lay it right on top of this drawn line on your square. And you're going to pick a size, and the beauty of this, now I know that this black square is smaller, so I need to pick a size that's going to be inside that black square. So I'm going to pick 5 1/4. And when you're doing this, all your squares are going to depend on the smallest size square you have. So I've got a little bit of edge there, and I've left a little bit edge here for trimming. So I've got this diagonal line on the draw line, and I'm going to trim the side, trim the top, flip it around. Now I picked 5 1/4, so I'm going to take my 5 1/4 and line it up with the bottom and the two sides that were already trimmed. And then make sure my diagonal line is on top of that drawn line. And I'm going to go ahead, trim the last two sides. Now I can cut these blocks apart on that drawn line, and I'm not going to be real picky about it. I'm going to eyeball it. Just follow that line and separate the squares. So now I will press those squares open. And the beauty of this is that you don't have to do any more trimming. That's it. If you do it that way, they will be all the same. So When you go to press at this point, you want to be very gentle. Be very, very gentle with this so that it doesn't distort on you. So now all I got to do is clip off those dog ears. And there's my block. Pretty easy, right? Less trimming, less trying to make things the right size. When you do it this way, they all come out the right size. So now we've talked about what if the squares are not the same size. We got that figured out. Now, what if I want to use my squares with yardage? So here's an example of that. You take your squares, you're going to cut your yardage. You can see this is a strip of fabric on the back here. Okay, you're going to cut your yardage in strips. And the size of the strips will be determined by the size of your squares. And I like to go about 1/4 inch bigger than my largest square. You know, what you're going to do is make sure that these lines that you've drawn are laid out in a large zigzag. Okay? There's a trick to this. So now we're going to stitch this. We're going to start at one corner and we're going to sew all along the left side of the line. Every time you get to the end of a line, you're going to pivot for the next line. So here we go. Oh, and I forgot to mention, you want to pin. You don't have to pin a lot, but you want to pin like the 4 sides of the square so it doesn't flop around on you. Okay, so I'm going to just cruise down this line here. And when I get to the end, I'm going to lift up my needle on my foot and pivot this around. Move it over so that my presser foot lines up with that line, and then keep stitching. Again, I get to the end, lift my needle and my presser foot, pivot this around, line up the foot with the line, and keep on sewing. And I'm going to continue to do this till I get to the end of my strip. One more time. Okay, so I've gotten to the end of my strip. Now we're going to pivot the whole thing. Again, lift my needle and presser foot, pivot the whole strip around, move it over. Sometimes you have to pull it a little bit to get the thread to behave. And then start stitching. And I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to stitch all the way down this. At the end of each block, I will pivot and continue on the next block. Pretty cool, right? This is even better than chain piecing. So I'll just keep going. Pivot again. And I'm going to finish sewing this so that I can show you how to trim it. Because we got a trick for trimming this too. one more. Okay, so our strip is done. So now, take out all the pins. And now we're gonna press this while it's all in one piece. It's more stable that way. You won't have any distortion, which is a big plus. So now I'm going to take this over here to the iron. I'm going to start at one end and just go ahead and press. And just work my way down the row. Okay, that's that. So now we're going to trim. So to trim this, like I've already shown you, you're going to take that diagonal line on your ruler and you're going to lay it on that first square, and you're going to again line it up with the drawn line, put that diagonal line on the drawn line, pick the size square you want. So I'm going to pick 5.5 for this one. And trim the side, trim the top, and move it aside. Now the thing is, I could go through and just cut in between the squares, but that's one more step of cutting, and who wants to cut more? So this is why we're doing it this way. So I'm going to turn this around, lay the ruler on the block, find my measurement, cut the side, cut the top, move it aside, go to the next block, turn that around. Same thing, putting the diagonal on there, on that drawn line, find my size. And you have to go, the size you pick has to do with the smallest square you have. So set that aside. One more. Now I've noticed that a couple of these squares are bigger than the others, and when I did the first one I was looking at the bigger size. So I'm going to have to go back in and trim that down a little bit. Okay, so now we've got our squares. Now I'm going to flip them around. Now I'm going to find my measurement. I'm going to make this 5.25 instead of 5.5 because I can see that two of my squares are smaller. Again, line it up, line that diagonal line on your ruler with the drawn line, and then finish trimming the other two sides. And you go back through and do that with all of these. So you're doing less trimming and still getting some really good accuracy, which is really cool. The key here is to be gentle with the iron. Make sure when you sew on either side of the line that you're consistent, the same 1/4 inch, and then you should have no problem with these squares being exactly the same. So again, now like I did before, I can separate these squares. You don't have to be picky about that line. As long as it's close, it's good enough, so that's easy too. And then you'll open these up and you'll press them. So that's how you do it with yardage. So now, what if you got fat quarters you want to use? So here's a fat quarter. I've laid out my squares in the same diagonal line, or the zigzag, you want your diagonal line to make a zigzag. So I've got a large zigzag going here on each row. And you want to leave a little bit of space between each row, because once you get this laid out, you're going to lay these blocks out in rows. So then all you need to do is cut the rows apart. No fussy ruler, no being picky about it. You cut your rows apart and then you sew them just like we did just a couple minutes ago with the rows. And there you go. Super easy, right? So now, what if you want to work with big squares? So here we've got some 10-inch pre-cuts. I cut a strip of fabric. You can see the background fabric. It's a large strip of fabric that's about a 1/4 inch bigger than the squares. Do the same exact thing we already did. Sew on either side of the line. Do your trimming. Then separate the blocks, press, and you are good to go. So now I want to show you a quilt top that I did with this. I just finished this yesterday, and this was my experiment with this technique, and it worked out really well. So these are all the half square triangles that I did just like I showed you, and I was really pleased with how well they matched up to each other. They fit together really well. It's a cute scrappy quilt. You could do all kinds of things with this. You could do certain color scheme where you've got maybe blues and yellows, and that's all you use. This one is a kid's quilt, so I used all these kid prints and tried to sort them into light and dark. So some of them you can see the light and dark a little bit easier, like on this one. Some of them it's not quite as easy to see. So I toned it down by using this mild sashing fabric. And I thought it turned out really well. I was really happy with it. It'll make a great little kid's quilt. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you give it a try. I hope it's been helpful to you, and that you will see how much it's going to help you save some time and energy. And if you make something, I'd love to see it. So have a great day. See you later.